So yeah, I've taken 2 permaculture design certificate classes, both of them online, and both of them run about a year or more. The one that I've finished so far is Jeff Lawton's online permaculture class, and I'm still working on Morag Gamble's class that is a combination of a regular PDC and also a certification to teach permaculture. So it's a 2-part class. Okay, let me just minimize all this stuff. Okay, so I'd like to talk first about what a permaculture design is and what it isn't. So I've heard people who aren't familiar with permaculture refer to it as sustainable gardening or organic gardening, and that may be a part of it, but it's not just gardening. It's actually a system, a design system, where all the parts are supposed to kind of work together to make the whole continuously better. So all the waste is ideally being recycled back into the system to make like fertility, for example. And so a big part of that could be gardening, but it's not just gardening, it's a whole system of design. And usually a permaculture design will take place on degraded land rather than land that's already fully functional and super healthy. And the reason for that is because part of the purpose of a permaculture design is to improve the soil, improve the habitat for various creatures, and improve the interactions between humans and the land. And so the maximum benefit will happen on degraded land. And finally, permaculture is applicable to all scales and all situations. So what made me want to do this is that I bought a house, which is something that I felt immensely privileged to have, especially in California where land is so expensive. And I just felt like having access to land was an opportunity and maybe even a responsibility as a homeowner to sort of work with it and improve the situation, because what we do on even small plots of land can make a big difference and even help to combat the climate crisis. So part of what I'm interested in is how suburban lots can collectively be used for an immensely powerful purpose, which is to improve ecological conditions and, again, like combat the climate crisis. And if you think your conditions are really too poor to or unworkable for something like a food garden, I encourage you to check out Andrew Millicent's series of YouTube videos called India's Water Revolution, which documents these small villages in India that had extremely degraded land and implemented permaculture design to totally improve their situation, improve their economic situation, and be able to grow food all year round with extremely minimal rainfall. The same is true for Jeff Lawton's series of videos called Greening the Desert, which documents his permaculture design in an area of Jordan that had really terrible soil, no soil life whatsoever, and extremely low rainfall. And he ended up creating a little oasis that produces fruit. It has fruit trees, it has vegetable gardens, and he's created jobs there. So those are 2 really inspiring examples that come from places that have really bad conditions, and both show what is possible with very simple solutions. But I also want to mention that you don't even need land. There's another video, which is going to be sent around with the resources, of a woman in Nairobi who lives in a 5th floor apartment who has a really amazing permaculture system from her apartment. So she does have a balcony, and she has chickens, worms, a vegetable garden, crickets, black soldier fly larvae. she grows mushrooms, and there's just all kinds of amazing things that she does. So that video is also really inspiring. And so with my property, again, I just wanted to put some of these ideas into practice and kind of experiment. So here is a little graph of the permaculture ethics in the middle, which are people care, earth care, and fair share. And then the principles around the edge, which I won't read, but I just want to call attention to a couple. And the first one is here, observe and interact. So ideally, you're supposed to observe for a year. So you're watching where the sun falls, and you're looking at all the conditions for a full year before you make any drastic changes. Another one is use small, slow solutions. And so what this means is, instead of hiring like an excavator to dig a swale, start with a shovel. And the reason is that any changes you make will be less intrusive, and they'll be more easily reversed. And the reason I point these two out in particular is because I violated these and had some bad effects from them. So I'm going to talk about my mistakes later, but just some things to keep in mind with that. Okay, so my property is just a typical suburban lot. It's 8,700 square feet, minus the house, minus the driveway, the shed, the carport, and a really large patio in the backyard. And so the area that's left isn't massive. It's not tiny, but it's not very large either. So anything that I am doing here, most people can do if they have a typical suburban lot. The before of the property looked like this, and it's, you know, really attractive. It's really well maintained, but this attractive veneer is hiding a lot of toxicity underneath. So the owner used a lot of toxic chemicals. There are extremely toxic plants that we could not have with our toddler, especially oleander. So we had to remove a lot of oleander, which is deadly, but also toxic building materials like railroad ties, which leach creosote into the soil, and improper water management. We moved in a really rainy winter, and a whole side of the house was always flooding. It was whenever we got rain, the water would just like stand on the side of the house. And so all of those problems were here, even though it looked really nice. A typical design process for permaculture is, again, I mentioned the observation. So first you observe for ideally a year. And with that, you're watching for all the weather conditions. You're watching for what weeds grow, what insects are present, what wildlife is there, as well as the climate and weather conditions. And then you do a bunch of research, including the history of how that lot has been used in the past. You research historic rainfalls and really everything you can possibly think of to find out as much as possible about the site. And then you make various maps. So here I have a zone map right over here on the left, which basically shows the areas that you use according to various frequencies that you visit. So the idea is that the closest zones are the ones that you visit the most, and then the ones that need a little bit less maintenance you put further away. And then here's a water map, which shows where the water flows and where it collects. Here is a sector map, which shows outside influences like where the sun falls throughout the year, any neighboring influences like noise or unsightly views, wind coming in at various times of the year, or in our case, smoke and fire potential. And then down here is a contour map showing the elevations on the site, which is here outlined in a white rectangle, and how it compares to elevations in the larger area. So you can kind of see where the water is going to flow and what else would be affected by that. And then the final design I'll get to in a second. So the goals that I had were I wanted it to be a productive and functional space. And what I meant by that was I wanted to grow most of our own vegetables, herbs, and fruits. I wanted to have eggs, medicine, tea, cuttings and seeds, and also education and fun. And I also didn't want it to be just about me and my family. I wanted to be able to share, any extras. So that could be donating to a food bank. It could be just sharing cuttings with people who also want to grow what I'm growing or whatever. But I wanted it to be something that could extend beyond just our family. I wanted to encourage the diversity of the wildlife and habitat, water efficiency, waste efficiency, and I wanted it to be beautiful and pleasurable to be in. My constraints, and let me move this a little bit. The big one was time. So when we moved in, I was finishing a PhD, so writing a dissertation and teaching. I was taking my 2 PDCs. I was the primary caretaker for my toddler, and we were also moving and getting settled in a new house. So the time was a big factor. I mentioned the flooding before, and here are a couple pictures of what that looked like. These two on the right are the side of the house that I mentioned. So it wasn't just like a few puddles, it was literally like a lake on the side of the house. And then the picture on the left is our street, which also tends to get flooded during heavy rain. But we had a gutter that was sort of on this corner here. I don't know if you can get an idea of what I mean, but the water was being channeled so that it would flow down and out to contribute to this flood. So we needed to find a way to keep the water out of the street and ideally in our soil. And another constraint or challenge was that, like a lot of people around here, we had really compacted soil. Ours was contaminated as well. It was just me doing most of this. I did have help in for various things, but for the most part, it was just limited by what I could do. My partner isn't really into this, and that's fine, but that was a constraint that I had to take into consideration when I made my design. Our budget wasn't super high, especially for the larger things like putting in the gray water systems and everything. And so that was something I had to work within the constraints of. And finally, our neighbors, most of them are elderly. They've lived on the street for decades, a lot of them, and they have very traditional views of what the front yard should look like. And so you can kind of get an inkling from this picture here of what the front yards look like, which is very pristine, well-maintained green lawns. And so the constraint of that is that I didn't want to be problematic on our street. I obviously didn't want a lawn, but I didn't want to create something that was unsightly or something that looked like a food garden necessarily. I wanted it to be something that people could appreciate visually and find the aesthetic value in, even though it was surrounded by green lawns. So that was part of the people care aspect of my design. So my design, this is what it looked like as of when I finished my first PDC, which was, I think, about March. And so the design, I would change some things now, like this little labyrinth system of raised beds here. I'm not going to do that. It's very impractical. And so some of this is different. I've added a lot more fruit trees since I made this particular design, but the basic elements are there, and it accommodates a lot. So it includes at least 43 fruit and herb trees. It allows for the collection of rainwater and gray water, including a pond, chickens, quail, worms. a greenhouse, and various other composting methods like just regular bins, and I'll get to some of the other ones later. But this is, you know, it includes a lot of stuff in this small space. So step one for me was to remove all the poisonous stuff, like the oleander, which you can kind of see here. It was all along the back fence. The 45 plus rose bushes, which I dug out by hand, and it took me at least a year to get all of them out from across the whole property. And there was some debris, and there was a big patch of ivy to the right of the driveway over here that likewise took at least a year to get completely out. Okay, step two. So I wanted to deal with this water situation. And so the first step for me of doing that was channeling the water away from the house. So this is the corner that was getting so flooded. And what I ended up doing was connecting this tube here with the gutter. And so it went underground about 10 feet or so away from the house and dumps out the water into this, what became this super long trench going all the way to the back of the yard. And yes, and then it was filled with wood chips, which over time will break down and can be used for mulch or for soil. But what this does is it slows the water down. Well, actually, we didn't need to slow the water down, but the typical thing that you want to do with water is to slow it down so that it isn't eroding. So in the front yard, for example, the water just kind of flows off into the street. And so you want to find a way to slow it down so it's not just running off and eroding. And then you want to spread it out to as large of a surface area as possible so that the water gets to as far as possible instead of just staying in one spot. And so that's one thing that this accomplished, is that instead of just keeping it by the house, look at how far this water is going. This is after a rain when the trench was just partially dug. And now it's watering what will become one of my main vegetable growing areas. So it's sinking down so that any perennial plants that will eventually be there can access the water, you know, underneath the ground that is sinking in. And so over time, this will actually raise the water table. And then the third thing is you want to sink it down into the ground, which I just mentioned. So slow it down, spread it out, and sink it into the ground is generally what you want to do. Also with the water is dealing with how I wanted to get water to the plants. And so the typical way here is to use drip lines, which I was kind of uncomfortable with because they're plastic, they break, and the backyard in particular is sort of awkwardly shaped for installing drip lines all over the place. And so I didn't really want to deal with it, and I wanted to find alternative ways to get water to the plants. So one way I've been doing that is by using oyas, which are these large clay pots. They kind of bulge out at the bottom here like this, and you bury them, and then you fill them with water, and the water will kind of wick out according to when it's needed. So if the soil's dry, it will naturally pull the water from the oya. If a plant root is growing near the oya, it will also draw out the water as needed. And so this helps prevent the water from evaporating. It keeps it deeper down into the ground, and it allows the plants to get as much as they want when they want it, instead of waiting for you to water from above, which may not even get deep down. I bought this oya, but you can also make your own oyas. And I actually have a friend who uses wine bottles in her potted plants and raised beds. So you can just take a wine bottle and fill it with water and then invert it into just kind of bury the top into the ground, and it will let the water kind of seep out under the ground and it won't evaporate, which is just like what an oya does. And then drip stakes or watering stakes, I've been trying out near trees. And basically what this is a tube that has holes in it, and it can be like 2 or 3 feet long. You hammer it down into the ground by a tree, usually a new tree that you've just put in. And then you water it from the top, and the water will kind of fall out of the holes. And so you're encouraging the tree's roots to grow deeper and get the water deeper down, so that it's not just relying on the surface water. And finally, the gray water. So eventually we'll get gray water systems put in. But in the meantime, I've been collecting shower water, like just in a bucket, and also sink water in the kitchen. And so I'll use both of those on the more water thirsty plants, the more thirsty plants, like bananas and stuff like that. And there are also pumps that you can get for bath water, where you just put the pump in the bathtub and then thread it out through a window, and you can get the water out to the plants that way. So so that's what I've been doing so far with that. Okay, so step 3 is to work on the soil, and the obvious way to do that is to add compost. And so some ways that I've been composting, and I have to say this is one of my favorite topics, is composting. I have a couple geo bins, which is actually here. They're just little cheap, easy things that you can connect. It's like a circular cylinder that you connect to it itself, and you can control how big it is. They're very cheap compared to a lot of composting bins, and you can move them around to the places in the yard that need it the most. And so if there's like a tree that isn't doing very well, I'll just take one of these and put it by the tree and start my new compost pile there. I have several worm colonies inside the house that produce worm castings. And so the advantage is kind of twofold. You have a place to put your food scraps, and then the worms produce pretty much the best thing you can ever put on your plants. Worm castings. It's like the greatest thing. And then here you can see on the bottom, I was making worm casting extract, which is just basically steeping them in water to make the nutrients go further, and then watering plants with the water. Inside, I also have Bokashi Systems. And so that is where you just put the food scraps in a bucket. You sprinkle it with this bran that's been inoculated with microbes, and the bran will basically pickle the food scraps. So you can leave it in there indefinitely, but as long as you leave it at least a week or two, you can harvest it and use it for various things. The advantage of Bokashi is that you can put things in there that you can't put in an outside bin, or that people generally don't want to put in an outside bin, like meat, bones, things that are going to attract rodents. Even dairy and things, anything that's kind of nasty or smelly that you don't want to put in an outside bin, you can put in the Bokashi, and the bran essentially pickles it. So it's not composting it yet, but it will just pickle it. And then after that process is done, you can put it in your regular compost, because now it doesn't smell like rancid meat, it smells like a pickle, and it won't attract rodents in the same way. You can also just bury it in the ground, and one way to do that is if you know you're going to plant something in a couple months, you can dig a hole and just bury a load of Bokashi there, and it'll break down and create this really good soil. You can also give it to your worms sparingly, and they actually really like it. And there's also a way to make soil like in a plastic bin. You can just put the finished Bokashi in the bin and mix it with soil from your backyard, and it will turn into compost for you. And so Bokashi is really useful for people who I think eat meat or have problems composting other things. you can do that from inside your house. Okay, and then the other thing you can do is, or that I've been doing, is just burying food scraps. And I've taken to burying them around this really big orange tree that I have that is really hard to keep watered and fertilized because it's just too big to do that with. So I've been burying food scraps and bokashi around the drip line so that it's getting fed and hopefully creating soil that is a little bit more absorbent of water when it does come around. And that's also called trench composting, just digging a trench and burying as you go. And lately I've gotten lazy and I've just been throwing food scraps around fruit trees. Like I'm pulling back the mulch, putting the food scraps around the fruit trees and putting the mulch back on. And I was a little dubious that that was a good idea at first, but it turns out to be a great idea because not only is it easy, but when I pull back the mulch now, I always see a ton of worms around the fruit trees. So it's beneficial actually to do that. And finally, the leaves here that you see, I'm not the only one who does this. I know a few people who do this, but every fall I've been going out to people's leaf piles on the curb that they put out to be collected and furtively stuffing them into garbage bags to use for my own purposes. And they're really useful. So so far I've collected about 12 or 13 garbage bags full, and I still want more. But you can just leave these to make a big pile and leave them to rot, and it'll create leaf mold, which is a really good thing to use in gardens. And you can also, especially if you chop them up a little bit, you can use them as mulch. They're just really useful. You can use them in the compost as a brown element. So those are just a few things I've done for composting. And recently I've also tried this, which is called a worm tower, which is just taking a bucket or some sort of cylinder shaped thing with holes in it. And you just put food scraps, soil, and some brown material, in this case, paper and leaves. And then you throw some compost worms in there and cover it with mulch, something just to keep them cool or warm. And they will break down the food scraps and create worm castings in the bucket that you can then harvest. I've also seen it done with hardware cloth, just tying hardware cloth together. And in that case, it would just passively improve the soil on an ongoing basis, and you wouldn't have to harvest the castings. It would just continuously improve the area around it. And so that's been really, so far, very successful. Okay, so another part of improving the soil has been using cover crops, which are plants that have some benefit for the soil in one of a few ways. And so one way that they can be beneficial is by fixing nitrogen. So that would be like these fava beans, anything in the legume family. So fava beans, crimson clover up here, and I have alfalfa in here as well, which also does that. And this area is sort of an example of how I've used cover crops. It's on the side of the house that was most contaminated by chemicals. I know that she was using Roundup over here a lot, and there was just nothing growing over here at all. So I was kind of reluctant to plant any like food over here at first. And so I planted a bunch of cover crops and just let weeds grow. Particularly alfalfa, which can indicate the presence of herbicides by getting certain indicators on its leaves. And at first, the alfalfa did have those indicators, but over time, as you know, I just kind of let things grow, and then I would chop them down and just let more things grow. And now the alfalfa is growing in a really healthy way. So I know that the soil is much improved here, but this is just something, you know, it's like a really passive way to improve the soil over time. And then Daikon Radish is another thing I've done to kind of break up the compressed soil. And the reason why that works is because the radish is very it like will drill down into the soil, and it creates this huge taproot that when you cut it off at the ground level, the root will decompose and be food for microbes and worms and whatever else. And it will also turn into something spongy that can absorb more water. So it creates like a hole, but filled with organic matter. And over time, that can really make a big difference. And I think it did over here. Another way that I've tried to improve the soil is by getting quail. And the main reason I got them was for their poop, so that I could compost it and make really good compost. But there are a lot of other reasons why I got quail as opposed to something like chickens. And one reason why I didn't want chickens is because, at least not yet, is because nobody else has chickens on my street, and I've mentioned my neighbors before. So I didn't want to be the only person, you know, having loud poultry in the backyard. So I chose quail because they're quieter. They're really quiet. They're undetectable if you're not actually in our backyard. You don't even know they're there. They require a lot less space. They don't need to free range, and in fact, they shouldn't free range because they don't come home to roost like chickens do. So they'll just kind of wander around and get eaten by things. And by nature, they're not prone to sort of roaming a lot. They like to hide and cower under vegetation, and they mostly they're extreme prey for a lot of things. And so they tend to just want to protect themselves, and they don't really want to be in the open anyway. So that's an advantage if you have a small space. It's really beneficial. They also do a lot of the same things that chickens do. So they lay eggs, they poop, they eat bugs. They lay eggs a lot earlier than chickens do. Their lifespans are very short, and so everything goes a lot faster. They can lay as early as 6 weeks versus 6 months for chickens. Another advantage of quail is that you can keep the roosters. They're not too loud. They're quiet, actually. And because you can keep roosters, you can then breed your own quail. So I'm planning in the summer, I'm really excited, I'm going to start a new flock by hatching out the eggs that I get because I have a rooster in there. Another advantage, I think, of quail is that their eggs do not carry salmonella. So you can feel a lot safer about handling the eggs, especially with kids. And you can even eat their eggs raw very safely, even though I don't know why you would do that. And finally, one advantage of quail that I'm not taking advantage of is the fact that if you want a really easy source of renewable, sustainable backyard meat, this is a perfect option. They're really easy to kill compared to chickens. Not that I want to kill my quail, but if that's your thing, you know, it's a lot easier and quieter of a process. And because you can keep hatching out your own birds, it's a sustainable and renewable source for you. So that's another advantage if you're into that. Finally, I just wanted to mention this cage, which I completely designed and built almost on my own. I designed it on my own, gathered the materials, and then my partner helped with the saw and the screwdriver. But other than that, I built this entirely on my own. And I just wanted to mention that because the theme of this presentation is, if I can do it, like literally anyone else can do it. And quail are so easy to keep that all they really need is this wooden box with hardware cloth over it. It doesn't even have to be tall, actually. They can do very well in short cages like this tall, about a foot and a half tall, which is what I'm going to do next time because it would save on lumber, save on effort, and they're just as happy, if not happier, in a shorter cage where they feel safe. Okay, another way I'm improving the soil is with organic renewable fertilizer sources. And the two that I am making use of are urine and menstrual blood. And I'm actually really proud of this, even though it might seem gross to some of you. I am really proud of this because these are things that would otherwise become waste. So again, with permaculture, the idea is to create a design system where the waste is being put to use for other purposes, whether it be fertility or something else. And so this is my way of doing that. So step 4, after everything is, the soil is improved, the water management is taken care of, now it's time to plant. And I made my choices about what to plant based on, first of all, how resilient are these plants on their own without being cared for by me. To be honest, I'm not really a very good gardener because I don't want to just dote on things. There are exceptions, but for the most part, I need my plants to just take care of themselves because I do a lot of hand watering, and I can't be out there for hours every day, you know, dumping water on all the plants or otherwise babying them. So, here's, okay. And so another way that I made the decisions about what to plant is through this permaculture concept called stacking functions, which basically means that every element in a design should ideally have more than one function. And so whether that be a chicken or a plant, that, you know, it can fulfill different purposes. So one example of that is, I'm going to move this down. I didn't have a very good picture of this, but one of my favorite things to grow that I have found is sesame. This is black sesame right here. And so obviously I wanted the seeds. That was my initial reason for growing sesame. It's a vegetable source of protein, which is always something I'm interested in. And it gives you so many seeds that it's not just something you can sprinkle on things, but it's something you could make into like a tahini paste or something. So it's a lot of seeds. But also you can eat the greens, the leaves, which means this is a summertime green that you can have, you know, when the sun is blazing down 1,000,000 degrees. And sesame actually thrives in a desert condition, so it does not want to be watered. If you overwater it, it'll die. So that for me is a huge advantage. And then on top of it, to have these heat tolerant, drought tolerant greens, that's another major advantage. The pollinators love it. So I see bees on these flowers all the time. They're like little bell-shaped flowers. They're really pretty and the bees love them. I also recently learned that sesame is used in phytoremediation, which means it can help to decontaminate contaminated soil. So you wouldn't want to eat a plant that's doing that, but it can be used in that way, which is really cool. Quail love sesame seeds, and I haven't had a chance to test this out with my own sesame yet, but that is another function of sesame in my system. And I bet chickens would also love the greens and the plant. When you get the seeds and the plant has died, you can cut it down and use it for mulch. And finally, it's beautiful. It's a really beautiful plant. It gets really tall and it has, again, these like really pretty bell-shaped flowers. So to me, that's a function. And so that makes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 functions that this one plant can fulfill. Some other plants that I have been experimenting with are chia over here, which is another vegetable source of protein because you grow it for the seeds, but the leaves are also edible. It's also beautiful. It's also a summertime drought tolerant green. Purslane here, which a lot of people already know, and some people don't like it because it's a weed, but it's a really healthy green to eat. It's a vegetable source of omega-3 fatty acids. And I actually planted this because I wanted purslane and I didn't have it in my yard already. But this is a cultivated upright variety to make it easier for harvesting. So that's purslane. And artichokes are obviously really beautiful and they produce food, but they have so many other functions besides that. Over here on the bottom left is called Doucette d'Alger, and it's an interesting leafy green that is also really beautiful that I was growing as an experiment. And down on the bottom here is a little flower garden, and most of it is edible. So this is geum, which is not edible, but this white flower is called sculpit, and it's a traditional Sicilian green vegetable that is perennial in our climate. It just keeps going and keeps producing greens, and I don't take care of it at all. I don't water it. I don't do anything with it except eat it, and it's still there. And then these yellow flowers are from the Perennial Arugula called Sylvetta, and again, it's extremely hardy, and it just grows on its own with no help from me at all. So just a few more examples of things that grow super easily. On the left is nasturtium, and that will reseed in the wintertime. So this is the first winter I've had where it has reseeded completely, and I haven't done anything with it. I don't plan to do anything with it except eat it. In here is Etoy onions, and these are an indigenous variety of onion that's grown in Arizona, so it's extremely drought tolerant. I don't do anything with it. It just multiplies like crazy. You can use it like a shallot and like a scallion, and then, like I said, it just multiplies like crazy. Just replant a few of the bulbs, and next year it'll be the same. Everyone grows California poppy, and so do I, because why wouldn't you? But it's also a really interesting medicine. So it's it is related to the opium poppy, and its effects are kind of like that, only less intense. So you can make medicine that is extremely mild and safe for children that can relax you and like help you sleep if you have insomnia. But it's considered really safe and gentle. So that's another reason to grow California poppy. And then over here is just a few different things growing together. Okay, and finally, I just wanted to mention a few examples of edible landscaping that I've done in the front yard, because the front yard, like I said, I have taken pains to keep it looking somewhat normal, not like a crazy food forest that's out of control. Not that all food forests are, but I wanted it to look maintained and pretty. So on the left here is the Saffron Crocus, and it's just a crocus, but it's the Saffron Crocus. So I got so much saffron this year. They have, over the last year, completely multiplied. I think each bulb turned into at least 3 bulbs, I don't know. But I've gotten a lot of saffron this year, and to be honest, I completely forgot they were even there, because after the green part dies off, it just looks like nothing's there. So I didn't even remember that they existed, and I actually planted a big plant like right next to them that I'm going to have to take out. So that's how little thought I've given to this crocus, and I haven't watered it or anything. I've done nothing. And it is doing just fine. And over here is the Vitex, or chaste tree. It's a very common landscaping plant here, but it actually it's considered highly medicinal, and it's something I used to buy in pill form, but now I just have it growing in my front yard. It's really beautiful. The pollinators love it, and it's completely normal looking here because other people have the same thing, but it's also a medicinal plant that I grow for the seeds. Okay, so the next step, and of course all these steps overlap, so it's not like I'm doing one then the other, but the next step is to remove the grass. So I want no grass in my property eventually. And I've been little by little just getting rid of it, but rather than digging out the sod laboriously, I've been doing what's called sheet mulching, or it can also be known as lasagna gardening. But you basically just pile up things over the grass and let it die and then plant stuff into it. So over here on the left is the first step for me, which was just some leaves and food scraps and stuff like that. I have yarrow and alfalfa and comfrey in there, which I specifically have been growing for purposes like this, because they're all really nutritious to use for fertilizing other plants. And then the next step was just some amendments like worm castings and manure and stuff like that. Cardboard, and then some bad soil that I had from another, leftover for something else. And then mulch, in this case, leaves. And then you just leave it for a couple months, a month or two. And when you finally dig into it, it's just soil. The grass has decomposed. And the advantage of this is obviously less labor than digging sod. And in this case, you're using the grass. So you get the nitrogen from the grass that will then feed whatever plants you're putting into it. And in this case, I was making space for a lemon tree, but I've been doing this slowly with the front yard to get rid of all the grass there too. And so here's an example of what I mean. The bottom right picture is the before, so it's just grass. And then I started by the sidewalk because that was the sunniest spot, and I just sheet mulched. And it doesn't have to be as complicated as I said. It can just be as easy as cardboard and newspaper and mulch on top. And then eventually, it'll just become soil. So that's what I've been doing. And the top right is what it looked like at first. And then this picture here is what it looks like now. So it could be better, but this is, to me, is a huge improvement over grass. And another thing about this is that 95% of this is edible. So I'm out here all the time getting vegetables and herbs. It doesn't look like a food garden, or it doesn't look like a vegetable like with rows or anything, but it is. It's a food garden. It looks like a typical drought tolerant landscape. So so that was my goal, and I think it's going pretty well. Okay, so mistakes. I've made a lot. The first one was buying many yards, like several yards of this really bad soil that people recommended to me from a local supplier of wood chips and stuff like that. And this soil is so bad that even after you water it deeply, it will be like bone dry underneath. So I spread this everywhere. And the reason I did this is because I was just in a hurry. I wanted to make things better. I wanted to improve the soil. I wanted to be able to grow things. And so I hurried up and I just bought something that ended up, being a detriment to me actually. So that goes along with my next mistake, which was hurrying. And so this goes back to the principles I mentioned again, which are number one, observe and interact for a long time before you make changes. And the ninth one, use small and slow solutions. So obviously I didn't do that. And, I'm paying for it even now because I'm still dealing with that soil. It was a huge mistake. Another mistake was not prioritizing putting wood chips over every patch of bare soil. I knew that I should, but I was having some logistical issues getting wood chips, and it was just a hassle, so I didn't end up putting it all over the place. I put it on select areas, but as a consequence, I have some areas that could have been a lot better by now, but they've spent the summer baking in the hot sun and cracking open. So, that was another mistake. The jury is out on the drip irrigation, whether that was a mistake or not. There are some problems with not having it, but I think there would also be problems having it. So that's still an ongoing experiment. Going back to principles 1 and 9 and hurrying up and all that. because I wanted to get trees in as soon as possible because they just take so long, I ended up planting a bunch of trees that I had to move because I didn't have my final design that I was very confident about. And so I put the trees in and then realized, oh, I don't really want them there. And then I would move them. In some cases, I moved them a couple times, which you really shouldn't do. So learn from me and don't do that. And still to be done is mainly the more expensive, long-term, like extreme changes that we have to hire people for, like the gray water and the solar panels and stuff like that. And so I do have some advice based on my own experience. The first is to take it slow and realize that, you know, there's really no rush. There's a lot of time and things will benefit if you just acknowledge that from the beginning. Be prepared to fail and also don't be afraid to fail. If something doesn't work, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is just that you tried it out and, you know, now you learned something. Keep learning, so always be seeking out other people's experience through talking to other gardeners, reading books and articles and YouTube videos and stuff like that. Experiment. So this is super fun to have the opportunity to basically just a giant science experiment in your backyard. It's a really fun thing, and you know, you should have fun doing it and have fun experimenting with it. If there's something you want to try but you're not sure it's going to work, just try it, and if it doesn't work, then it just doesn't work. But I think, you know, experimenting is what keeps things really interesting. And something I didn't realize at first either is that the process is going to go on forever. When I first started, I wanted everything to be settled and finished so that I could now just be done and just enjoy the garden. But actually, I've realized that the process is partly what I enjoy about the garden. It's a constant interaction, constant improvement, you know, feedback loop. And so if you're, you know, planting, try to enjoy that. If you're designing something new, try to enjoy that. But it's not going to end even when you think it will at some point. It just won't. So try to enjoy the process. If you're interested in getting updates about my ongoing process, I do have an Instagram account that you can follow me at. It's basically just updates about my garden, mistakes that I've made, and my thoughts about gardening and permaculture. So, but that's it. Thank you so much for listening.